Welcome to Brain Ponderings, your window into neuroscience and its interrelationships with society and impact on society, medicine, and so on. Today, my guest is Pascal Molenberghs. He's an investigator at the Institute for Social Neuroscience in Ivanhoe, outside of Melbourne, or part of Melbourne, I guess, down there in Victoria, Australia. He's done a lot of research on trying to understand, both from a social interaction, society-wide standpoint, and what's going on in the brain, tribalism, xenophobia, and then also it's done a lot of work on empathy. So he combines experimental systems with brain imaging. He's done a lot of functional imaging and been involved in those studies. So welcome, Pascal.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice to be on the podcast.
And you're from Belgium originally?
Yes, that's correct. So yeah, I grew up in Belgium and did my master and PhD there in Belgium, and then afterwards moved to Australia, a couple of different places at the University of Queensland, and then Monash University, University of Melbourne, and now, as you mentioned, at the Institute for Social Neuroscience.
And so was your PhD work? It's not on what you're working on now, was it?
No, actually, my PhD, it was also on neuroscience, but it was more on attentional processes and spatial neglect with stroke patients and healthy people as well. But yeah, there was more on attention and as I mentioned, like neglect. Although for my master thesis, I also worked on intergroup processes, so I always had an interest in it. But yeah, then after my PhD, I kind of combined, I guess, my knowledge of neuroscience with my interest in intergroup processes, and then started to investigate, I guess, the social neuroscience of intergroup processes.
Yeah, this is very important to interface between kind of social science and neuroscience, because ultimately all social interactions involve what's going on in the brain of individuals.
Yeah,
now, can you talk a little bit from an evolutionary perspective of why you think, or what's the value? There's clearly value in tribalism, in putting priority over the people closest to you, I guess, family, tribe, or, we start out hunter-gatherers, small groups, maybe 100 people. And then I guess there was, kind of bound, like any animal, actually, they have established territories, right? That they kind of, that's where they get their food, and if another animal invades their territory. So this goes, way back before humans, I think, this kinds of self-preservation and preserving the gene pool, right? Because the idea is survival and reproduction, and what gives you advantages in doing that. So can you talk a little bit about the evolutionary perspective?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, the first people that we take care of is obviously ourselves and our family members. And yeah, I guess for good reason, because they're genetically, I guess, more similar to us. So I guess from a genetic point of view, it makes sense that people kind of care about those people the most. And then beyond that, I guess it's kind of like group members, like extended family, and then people who kind of live in a community are also, I guess, more likely to be, genetically similar. But also, I guess, from an evolutionary point of view, especially in the past where we kind of hunter-gatherers, it makes sense to kind of, take care of our group members, because they, kind of do things for us. They protect us against invaders, and often, especially in the past, when, there was like contact between neighboring tribes, let's say, or different, geographic locations or ethnicities, that often would end up in, conflict and war. So it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that we have to be very sensitive, I guess, for out-group attacks on in-group members, because they pose an existential threat, I guess, is for the survival of our in-group. Obviously, on the other hand as well, we have to learn to collaborate with others as well. And that's obviously very important as well. Even people who are different from us, and especially now in multicultural societies, We have to make sure that we can collaborate with different people, different groups. So it's kind of those dynamics that play a role. But I guess from an evolutionary point of view, we always have been very focused, I guess, on making sure that our family members and beyond that our group members are kind of feel safe and protected, and that we're kind of a little bit wary, I guess, of people who are outside of those groups.
Yeah, and then at some point, like 10 or 11,000 years ago, there's agriculture was developed, right? And then the group size got much bigger because people weren't, foraging for food and hunting. They could grow crops and stockpile whatever, grains or whatever, and then they domesticated animals. And so that led to like big increases in the group size. And then it seems like, so this still continued though, this, in groups and out groups. And things, my view of this is that then certain institutions were established to kind of foster in-group cohesion. Religion's one, but there are other governments and so on, and to have establish some order within the system so that within the in-group, there's not a lot of fighting. But then still, there's out-groups. There's always in-groups and out-groups, unfortunately. And this continues, and we can talk about this, and you've looked at this a lot from the standpoint of, religious affiliations, and usually it's the problem is are a lot of issues, more than me, but when people don't talk to each other and communicate with each other, then it's hard for there to be any kind of reconciliation between the groups. Okay, but anyway, how do you go about studying these issues, which they're very important issues and has to do with what's going on in the brain? How do you study this?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, cooperation obviously is very important as well. And especially, as you mentioned, like in the last 10,000 years, when people's groups started to become much more bigger, we started to see like cities, we started with countries, collaboration between countries, trades, international trade. So obviously that's an important aspect as well of intergroup relations. But at the same time, we also, even in our modern era, we see big wars, think about World War I, World War II, obviously a conflicts going on today. So it's not that, all wars have suddenly stopped, and even, sometimes the deaths can be even more bigger than they might have been in the past. But yeah, talking about how we kind of study these processes from a neuroscience perspective, in my case, I kind of use brain imaging and more specifically fMRI, which stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. So here, basically, simply we put people inside a brain scanner, an MRI scanner, and we let it do certain tasks, and then we kind of measure their brain response or something, at least relate to the brain response, the bolt response. And then we kind of see which parts of the brain become active while they're doing certain tasks. Now, to kind of study, obviously, intergroup relations inside a scanner where a person is just by themselves is always a bit tricky, right? Like we cannot just put a scanner on their head and then put them in a war zone and see what happens. So we always try to, recreate as best as possible, I guess, these situations where people, might have intergroup interactions, I guess. But sometimes, yeah, it's tricky, obviously, to make it as real life as might have happened in the real world. But yeah, we do like a variety of different things. Like, for example, in the past, we had like people, also different group members, like, for example, students from the same university versus from another university, or people from one political party versus another political party, or people from one ethnic group versus another ethnic group. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, we put them inside a scanner. And then, like, for example, there's one study that we did where we asked them to give rewards or punishments to in-group or out-group members. So we told them they were meeting another person, and they were meeting actually two other people, and we told them this person is from the same group, so from the same university, and the other person from another university, and you're going to go inside the scanner and going to give them rewards or punishment based on their answers. And they were basically being told that these people outside the scanner were doing like a little quiz where they have to answer some questions, and then depending if they answer correctly or incorrectly, they had to give them either an electroshock or a monetary reward. So if they got it wrong, they had to give them an electroshock. If they got it correct, then they would give them a monetary reward while we kind of measuring their brain responses. And yeah, in that case, we obviously found different brain regions activated while they're giving rewards versus punishment, but we also then found differences when people were giving those things to in-group or out-group members. Now, in this particular case, we only found a difference between in-group and out-group members in relation to the reward. So there was more brain activation in the areas that were involved in reward processing when they gave rewards to in-group members compared to out-group members. But in regards to punishment, we didn't find a difference in this study, which kind of suggests because the universities, although there was kind of competition between the universities, wasn't like a major rivalry or anything. So, and again, it kind of shows that although we're more happy that our group wins in this case, we're not necessarily, you know, at least in this particular case, more happy to give a punishment to an in-group or an out-group member. At least that's how we interpret those results. But obviously in more extreme situations, you know, like in a real war, obviously we would expect quite big differences. So we also did, for example, another study where we tried to take a little bit more extreme, where people were put inside a scanner and they were playing, well, we kind of told them to pretend it was like a real life situation where they had to kill from a shooting perspective, like either innocent civilian or a soldier that was attacking them. And then we also measured brain response while they were doing them. And what we found was that people, when they were killing an innocent civilian, showed much more brain activation, especially in areas involved in displeasure and feelings of displeasure, compared to when they were killing a soldier that was attacking them. So in those situations, the different groups are not necessarily like in-group or out-group, but are like one group being innocent civilian and another, I guess, being a soldier that's kind of attacking them. But yeah, in those groups, we did find some differences in brain activation in relation to punishment. But yeah, it depends a little bit on the type of study that you're doing. Similarly, there's no one brain region involved in, obviously, in intergroup relations. It depends a lot on what you're specifically focusing on. You know, in theory, the whole brain is involved, I guess, in these intergroup relations. But yeah, it depends a little bit on what you're focusing on. Another example is that people, so for example, a colleague of mine in China, he kind of did a study where they presented people with video clips of people being in pain. So basically they had like a needle penetration to their cheeks, and the control condition was like a cotton swab, so a non-painful condition. And the participants were then Chinese people, and they kind of watched video clips of Caucasian people and then Chinese people receiving this stimulation. And then I found the brain regions involved in empathy to be more active when people were showing these kind of painful pricks to people from their own group compared to the other group, which kind of suggests that people were feeling more empathic responses for in-group members compared to out-group members. But yeah, I would say from my studies, especially here in Australia, like quite a multicultural society, especially if you do, I should say, like, let's say between racial groups or between even like groups that there's no strong animosity between each other, the differences are often quite subtle, which kind of makes sense as well, because, you know, if you go about in a multicultural society, it's not that, you know, you see someone from a different race or from a different group that you automatically go and attack them or, you know, or feel negative feelings towards them. So I think it depends a lot on the situation. The only, I would say, study where we found like very big differences, and I was quite surprised by that, is when we had people from political parties. So here in Australia, we had like kind of Liberal and Labor. I guess you can compare a little bit between Republicans and Democrats in America. And here we found very big difference. So the people that we got in were very strong supporters of the political party. And here we presented them with like statements of in-group and out-group leaders, and they were either very inspirational or very non-inspirational. And but across participants, their statements were exactly the same. So people didn't, we just kind of made up the statements, but people didn't know it. but were never processing statements that they believed were from their in-group leader compared to the out-group leader. The brain responses were like very different, even like completely opposite. They were almost processing the inspirational statements from the in-group, similarly in a way like the non-inspirational, let's say, from the out-group. I mean, there were some differences there as well, but like they were more focused on inspirational statements from their in-group and very much focused on non-inspirational statements from the out-group, which also kind of suggests a little bit, you know, if you're like a Democrat, then it doesn't matter what Donald Trump says, you will always interpret negatively, and vice versa. If you're like a Republican and she says something, you might, you know, like focus very much on the negative. But I found that was quite interesting in a way that, you know, in our current multicultural society, it's obviously very frowned upon to be, you know, racist or even versus people from a different religion. And I guess in the general population, especially in this experimental situation, we don't see that much difference. But in political groups, it's almost like the only place where you can still be, it's obviously not a race, but you can still be racist, you know, like the old days when it was okay to be racist in a sense. So there it still kind of seems fine to have very strong negative views about the out-group. But again, I think it depends a lot on the situation. You know, if suddenly tomorrow a war breaks out, you know, let's say, for example, between China and Australia, for example, then I think, you know, as we saw as well, you know, for example, during World War II, that in America, then Japanese people were very much discriminated against, you know, put in camps and things like that. So I think those things can quite, change sometimes quite dramatically depending on the situation.
Or the attack of the terrorists in New York City in 2001, that created a lot of anti-Muslim bias. One thing though, so different people seem to intrinsically or probably could have to do with their environment when they grew up, have different levels of empathy. And, you know, so a good example in the political realm is Trump, right? He has no empathy for anybody. It's quite striking, actually. And
I mean, it's I mean, I'm sure he has like empathy for some people, like his children or things like that. Or but it's true that he, especially towards our group members, he can definitely be harsh. And
it's interesting so like the war in Gaza now, right? That you know, it's very clear that it's very easy for like an in-group within the in-group to devalue the lives of the out-group, right? You know, you have children, a lot of children and women being killed seemingly kind of indiscriminately. And, you know, there seems to be no, at least outward appearance of any empathy for them from the country that's doing it.
No, definitely. Yeah, we see that in the news cycle as well. Often, you know, like people care, let's say, I know, well, for example, when there was the Hebdo attack in Paris, right? There were big demonstrations because it was an out-group attack on in-group members, on our values, on our Western values. There were a lot of protests, I guess, in the Western world. But obviously, if there's like a terrorist attack somewhere in the Middle East about out-group attacking other out-groups, you know, you don't see those massive outcries, or even sometimes it's ignored. On the one hand, it's also kind of interesting in a way that, especially now, seems to be on university campus, a lot of interest, I guess, in this specific Gaza conflict, because in theory, for a lot of them, both of them are almost like our group members, right? On the one hand, you have the Jews there in Israel, and then, you know, the Arab Palestinians in the rest of Palestine. So it's kind of interesting in a way. There's a lot of focus on that because, for example, other conflicts that happen at the same time, let's say in Yemen or even, you know, like other places there as well, they didn't see this mass kind of protest, for example, happening. Kind of interesting.
Can you get a little bit in the brain regions involved in empathy, right? In when someone's feeling empathetic towards someone, you know, someone suffering or.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the empathy research has focused on pain. Yeah. So, like seeing people, other people in pain. Obviously, empathy is broader in the sense you can also feel empathy for people being happy, or or other things as well. But most of the studies are focused on pain. And what's kind of interesting there is that a lot of the brain regions are kind of similar when we kind of feel pain ourselves. For example, if I'm hurting, so from activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, and also kind of similar brain regions are active when we see other people in pain. So just watching people in pain, you get very, I mean, it's not exactly the same, so it's not like exactly the one-to-one relationship. And it's obviously not as strong as well as feeling the pain ourselves most of the time. But it seemed to be like very similar in regards to brain activation.
That's the fMRI documentation of the phrase, I feel your pain.
Yeah, basically, like, yeah, it's a lot. I mean, there's also like different types of empathy, what we usually make a distinction between affective empathy and cognitive empathy. So affective empathy is kind of like, can call it like sharing of pain. I mean, it's a little bit more broader, but and there, as I mentioned, you get very similar brain regions, like the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, as already mentioned, when seeing other people in pain. And then the cognitive empathy is a more rational type of empathy. So, for example, a psychologist understanding that, or just another person, intellectually understanding that another person is suffering, doesn't necessarily mean you have to share those same feelings or that you have to be, distressed, but you still understand that that person is feeling pain. And those regions overlap more with brain regions involved in theory of mind. So, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, temporal parietal junction, precuneus, those kind of areas. So yeah, those are the main types of empathy that we distinguish too. So affective empathy is kind of sharing the pain. So if you kind of see a scary movie and you get scared yourself, those are people, score high in affective empathy. And then the cognitive empathy, as I mentioned, more like rational understanding. Like for example, a psychologist understanding that client is in distress.
So the emotional component of empathy is kind of like the mirror. Is it the mirror system? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously part of that as well. I mean, it's not exactly as I mentioned. Like it's not that when I see someone in pain and feeling the pain is obviously not exactly the same emotion, right? It's not really like, for example, let's say laying on the ground and crawling in pain. So there's not a direct one-to-one relationship, but like the mirror system or the mirror neurons kind of play obviously some role in there. It's kind of like how do I understand, for example, what goes on in another person's mind? One thing that can help is that if I rely on previous experience of me feeling pain and those brain regions become activated. So, in that way I can help understand, I guess, how you're feeling. Similarly, if I had a very similar experience, like for example, if let's say my child died and I'm talking to another person whose child died, I'm going to have a much richer experience, a more richer empathic feeling towards that person than if I wouldn't have been in that situation. So yeah, definitely mirroring kind of plays a role, but it's also much more broader, as I mentioned. Yeah, the cognitive aspect obviously plays their role as well. But even I guess with the affective feelings, it's not exactly the same, but it does play a role, I guess, that sharing component. Another important component, I would say, of empathy is what we call like emotional regulation. So, for example, if I'm a surgeon and I need to operate on somebody who's in pain, I don't want to share, those painful feelings too much because then I won't be able to operate, or even, maybe feeling their pain or having too much might interfere with my work or might disinhibit me from being able to do something. So I must also very much be able to control my emotions. So that's obviously important, for example, a surgeon. There's also some discussion with, with like what people call like psychopaths, where they often say, oh, those people don't have emotions, but there might be psychopaths who actually don't have emotions, but there's also often more that they do have emotions, but they're very good in controlling their emotions. So where even people say, to be a good psychopath or a good torturer, you have to have empathy, you have to know when a person is suffering. but you must be very good in like controlling your own emotions, so you don't necessarily share those emotions, so you can manipulate people and things like that. So that's kind of an important distinction as well, I think.
So that's related. So this I guess it's a German word, Schadenfreude.
Yeah, Schadenfreude. I mean that's people have kind of looked at that as well. Some fMRI studies on that as well, where for example, looked at competition between different teams, and then when they lost, especially when it was a team that had a high competition with it, I actually felt positive feelings when kind of watching that. That's another component as well.
So that's essentially taking pleasure when something bad happens to someone in an outgroup, usually in an outgroup.
Yes, that's right. So when let's say when you're like a strong supporter for team A and they're competing for the title with team B, and then team B loses, then I guess you're kind of happy, you kind of feel good for the misery because it can benefits your team. Well, it might not necessarily be the case if let's say team C, who are at the bottom of the ladder, if they lose, you don't necessarily feel good or bad about that. We might even feel bad for them because they don't necessarily are in direct competition between you. But yeah, especially when there's strong competition, especially when there's kind of limited resources, in those situations, we often see this kind of
when it's someone you don't know, usually. So,
even
for example,
in sometimes situations, we sometimes see it as well when like when they say fire at an enemy and then they get killed, and then they kind of celebrate that, especially if they're not directly involved.
Or I've seen like on YouTube, there's these videos where people put together clips of people like having an accident and getting hurt. And so obviously a lot of people look at those. So I think people are taking pleasure in seeing someone crash on their bicycle and get hurt, or crash up their car or whatever like that. So this is I'm not sure what the evolutionary value of that is, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, I mean, especially if they're kind of outgroup members and you don't necessarily have a strong affinity with it. Like, I mean, I think a lot of things can play with something like we also like call karma, right? Like someone being, a very kind of negative person, and then they kind of end up afterwards, being punished for that, or like treating someone and then they kind of being punished for that, sometimes feel good for that. So I think there are often important evolutionary thing plays. Let's say somebody steals from you and they end up in prison, or they kind of have a misfortune themselves, you kind of feel happy with that. So it's kind of like a natural justice. But at the same time, especially if outgroup members kind of attack you and they kind of pose an existential threat and something happens to those outgroup members, it's kind of normal in that sense as well to kind of feel good about that as well, because then they're being punished or even killed, which is, I guess, a good thing for you if it
and then what leads to kind of a transition from having an opinion or about say someone in an outgroup and violence? What can lead to violence? Because this is kind of an important thing. People can think what they want, I guess, but when it negatively impacts somebody, then that's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think a lot has to do, I guess, obviously with the situation. I think now we also have like very strong norms against violence. Let's say in a kind of modern societies, there's very much frowned upon to use violence. So there's a lot of pressure, I guess, to not use violence. But that being said, I think sometimes if situations change, let's say there's a war, people can quite easily switch from being non-violent to violent, right? Like similar, as I mentioned, the previous example, in a multicultural society, we wouldn't go out and see someone from another country or different ethnicity. If I would go out in Australia and see someone, who looks Chinese or is from China, I wouldn't go out obviously and harm them or kill them. But let's say again, if suddenly a war breaks out between Australia and China, and I would have to go and fight in a war, and in those situations, people would be more likely to commit violence. So yeah, I think the situation obviously a very important thing. In regards to violence, I think it's also like multiple things at play, how far it goes. So sometimes it can just be feeling, less empathy, but another important aspect we'll call like dehumanization, where we don't necessarily see other humans as humans. We kind of see them, let's say as cockroaches or inferior humans, or people, are more like robots, or people are more like, like chimpanzees, or, what I mean, like without higher intellectual abilities. And in those kind of situations, I think also it's more likely to kind of lead to violence. So definitely humanization plays an important part. And then obviously the empathy component, although the relationship between empathy and morality or pro-social behavior is also quite interesting in the sense that there's no like a direct, not necessarily always like a direct relationship. Like a colleague of mine, Professor Jean Desti from the University of Chicago has written quite a lot on that, on the neuroscience of that as well. But basically, people often think that more empathy means more pro-social behavior, but it's not necessarily the case. Like, for example, if I feel strong empathy for my child and somebody attacks my child, then I'm more likely to go and attack that person. Or if I feel strong empathy for my in-group, let's say if I'm a strong nationalist, I'm much more likely to use violence towards other outside group members, other countries. So, and similar as well, for example, having strong empathy for one particular person and giving them a lot of resources might necessarily be beneficial for the larger group. So in that sense, more empathy is not always a good thing. Often it can be, feeling more empathy for a person, trying to help them. Although there's a difference as well between empathy and sympathy.
So you're saying then, I could see that. So empathy can also, it's also important in strengthening in-group bias.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. And
that's not necessarily always a good thing. I mean, obviously in some situations it can be, obviously strong in-group bias, strong, feelings for the in-group and connection with the in-group often leads to, especially towards our group members, as we kind of see often, like I guess in nationalistic political parties, that they have a very strong focus on the in-group members and on the values of their in-group, but then also it's kind of associated with very much mistrust towards our group members, I guess, and even violence towards our group members. Yes, so definitely.
Do you have an interest in how the internet and social media are, and the algorithms of these companies are kind of amplifying in-group, out-group discord?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done much research on that topic. A colleague of mine, also kind of neuroscience focused on intergroup relationships, Jay Van Bavel from New York University has kind of looked quite a bit at that. But yeah, there's definitely, first of all, I guess with online situations, people are similar, I guess, if you're like in a car, people are often much more aggressive or like more, feeling less empathy than if you talk to a person directly. So if you talk to a person one-on-one, it's very unlikely it would be very aggressive or very inappropriate. But often on the internet, people being anonymous, they can say whatever they want. There's no filter, basically, while in real life, there are often like norms and filters of how people behave. So that's one component of it. But then also the algorithms of social media enterprises are often related to how much people kind of interact with it. So they want people to interact as much as possible with their specific software. And obviously the algorithm is kind of set up for those situations, and they can obviously choose how to do it, but usually it comes down to revenue. So they want as much people kind of interacting with things. as possible, regardless if it's like positive or negative. But often people get more upset or interact more if it's something upsets them or is, really out there. So in this case, often these kind of voices of people who are like more extremes are often kind of inflated, and there's more interaction with that. And obviously the algorithm picks up on that. That's going to be even more, more bigger than it would be in real life. Although I feel even in real life, often these things happen. People, let's say, get upset about some protesters either on the far right or the far left. But then, the other 80 or 90% of the population who just sits at home and go about their daily job, that doesn't come in the news, right? So it's kind of being ignored. But yeah, I think especially in online situations, it's being amplified, definitely.
Yeah. So let's see. What else? What are you working on now? So what's the institute you're at? Is that so you have a dedicated MRI there, do you?
We don't have necessarily one in the institute, but just like in Melbourne or even across Australia, we have like from a government, every time that they have like an MRI scanner for a university for research purposes, then basically everyone who has the money to kind of pay for it can use the MRI scanner. So I can go and use the scanner at University of Melbourne. I can go and use the scanner at Monash University. I could fly up to Queensland and go there, use their scanner. And yeah, there's a lot of, like even in Melbourne, I mean, just for research purposes, there are probably like 7 or 8, even like 70 MRI scanners, the latest scanners that we can use. So yeah, for example, from a latest study, I used the one at the University of Melbourne, the 70 MRI scanner. And yeah, as long as you kind of have the money to kind of pay for it, they have the grants, I guess, to pay for the scanner, then people are happy to use it. But yeah, we don't have a scanner inside our own institute.
A lot of the most recent podcast I did was with Daniel Schachter. He's well known for his work on memory and memory fallibilities. And so, one way we learn a lot about brain regions is by, in humans, accidents, like someone gets a brain injury and it damages a specific brain region, or with surgeries for epilepsy, remove part of it. Are there any like case studies of people who had some brain injury? You said you did some early work on stroke and traumatic brain injury, I think, and some deficits. Are there anything that leads to like a dramatic change in behaviors that are related to or involved with this tribalism or empathy or the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, my background, mentioned previously, was on stroke patient and spatial neglect, but we also kind of looked a lot on like brain damage and social neuroscience components. I mean, with intergroup relations and brain damage, I mean, I would say there's surprisingly little where studies that are found where, let's say, a person has like a stroke or other kind of brain damage, like traumatic brain injury or whatever, or surgery, but they suddenly, became like super racist, for example, right? I don't think there's any, or at least many studies, but there's often like, I mean, probably the most famous case is like Phineas Cage, like the rail worker had like his brain kind of pierced by actual dynamite and like a pole going to the front part of his brain, where he became, it's kind of claimed, I guess, it became socially inappropriate, right? Previously, he was known to kind of, be a well-respected member of the community, but after that, he started to become, more inhibited and more inappropriate and kind of lost his job and things like that. So there's definitely things about research about that, even like with frontotemporal dementia, where people kind of become less inhibited, or even like older people becoming less inhibited, let's say, in their thoughts. And obviously this kind of plays a role as well, obviously, in intergroup relations. If you become less inhibited, if you're more likely to say things that are appropriate and in that context, you might be more, appropriately racist. But but I think a lot has to do with the complexity, as I mentioned previously. It's not just one brain region involved in, intergroup relations, so that the whole brain is involved. For example, let's say, I don't know, let's say Broca's area, right? Like if that's being damaged and people have problems with speaking, or when I talk about spatial neglect, certain areas, often if they are damaged, people might have problems with their visual perception and see one part of their visual field. With brain regions, a little bit more subtle, like even just with empathy, there's like, well, there's more, I guess, but let's say 6 different brain regions involved. So the chance of them all being damaged at the same time is a little bit unlikely. Similar, let's say, if my affective empathy regions are damaged, maybe I become more cognitive empathy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I suddenly lose all empathy together, and vice versa as well. So, yeah, again, just because I become more, let's say, inhibited, doesn't necessarily mean I don't feel any empathy anymore for our group members. Do you know what I mean? So, and therefore, I think that there's definitely some subtle differences. As I mentioned, people should become more inhibited and let's say more what they think. But this complete transformation that we sometimes see in other disorders from people, let's say, being perfectly hearing to not hearing, or perfectly visible to not visible, or not seeing things. Or some speech
going from being far right to far left, or vice versa.
Well, yeah, those things. Again, I'm not sure it never happened. I'm sure that there's one case published somewhere, but yeah, it's very unlikely. Like that something like that would happen. That it really completely transforms people.
There's a lot, as you know, there's a lot of research going on now with psychedelics. What about that? I mean, in this kind of a general sense, my understanding is, well, it's beneficial for depression, but also it's, at least I've seen some reports that people become more, I don't know if they're more empathetic or less biased against outgroups. But has there been any research that actually looked at that specific aspect of behavior?
Don't know much about any study that looked at psychedelics and kind of intergroup relations, at least from a neuroscience perspective. I mean, it's definitely true that with some, I guess, psychedelics that people feel kind of more connected or more. They're similar, I guess, when people kind of meditate, or especially if they meditate a lot, that they feel more kind of more love for general and see kind of less of these boundaries. But I don't necessarily know about any specific, let's say, fMRI studies where people have gone, let's say psychedelics and then do like some intergroup relations research. Would actually be quite interesting to do that. I mean, with these things, it's often kind of tricky to get them through ethical approval, and depending on what you're kind of focusing on, giving people drugs to look at, because non-life-threatening things is sometimes tricky. So that's probably the reason why not much has been investigated. But yeah, it would definitely be an interesting area of research, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. What studies are you doing right now? And with what groups and what kind of experimental manipulation?
Yeah, like over the years, I always try to go, I would say almost like trying to get a little bit more extreme in a sense. We started off with just randomly divided people into groups, like they have to guess some number or whatever, and then said, are you like an over or underestimator? And then had to do a task. But there we always found like subtle differences. And then we had like, real groups like the university students that I mentioned already. Then, we brought up more extremes, like, for example, terrorists that were attacking them, or they had to shoot terrorists that they thought were carrying guns or no guns. And then also the political party that I studied that I mentioned. And yeah, and I found, as I guess you would expect, but the more kind of extreme you kind of make the groups, or the more socially acceptable kind of make it to be, overly biased, the stronger kind of the brain differences are. Yeah, especially as I mentioned previously, that one study with the political parties, because it was actually really fascinating in the sense that every time when I kind of did like a study between different groups, they always showed like a small difference in brain activation. Like for example, with empathy was a little bit more active in the in group compared to the out group, or or that feeling displeasure was a little bit more in the in group or the out group. But with the political parties, we really saw like opposite brain activation. Never seen it with like any of the 20 fMRI studies that I've done, even on other topics, or even other published studies where really you present people with exactly the same information, because usually if you present people with exactly the same information, the brain responds very similar, right? Like, okay, they might be a little bit more active than the other one. But here it was like really opposite, like just because people believe this information come from, the in-group leader compared to the out-group leader, the brain activation was like totally opposite. First, I thought I did something wrong, that I miscalculated or miscoded something in my programming, because I never see anything like it, but literally checked it like 10 times. There was something wrong with like the coding. It was all perfect, but it was just that people were really processing that exact same information. So exactly the same statements, completely opposite. And it was almost kind of, mind blowing in a way. But I think it also explains a lot what's kind of happening nowadays with people getting so upset, regardless of what a person says, if it's like good or bad thing, just because they're from an in-group or out-group leader, they totally, interpret it along their own lines. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, I guess more recently. I mean, we also sometimes do like other things. Our latest study has been actually not necessarily on intergroup relations, but has been on euthanasia, like how people when people have to make euthanasia decisions. So very a little bit different, I guess, than the typical intergroup relations. But it's also something very new, I guess, with euthanasia being proved in more and more countries. But it
So,
also
so,
relates to
so, so
empathy.
someone
Mhm.
making a euthanasia decision about someone else or themselves?
No, about someone else. So they were basically put inside the MRI scanners, and then we presented them with a euthanasia scenario. And some of them were very what we call like normative. So, like for example, a person has like terminal cancer, they're in pain, they're going to die in a couple of months anyway. Would you kind of grant them euthanasia? And then most people would say yes. But then the non-normative is something like a person just feels depressed, not life-threatening, but they still want to ask for euthanasia, which you kind of grant it in this scenario. And then most people would say no. And there was some variation between them. Um, but yeah, again, most of the studies I would say been focused on would be on empathy, morality, trying to get a better understanding, I guess, about those brain regions and how they're involved in different situations. So that's kind of our latest study we were focusing on. Yeah, it was quite interesting as well because it's quite new and novel. That was quite interesting about the fMRI that, for example, if you do like a certain study in behavioral science, you either get like A or B, and if it's not A, then it's B. But with neuroscience or fMRI, you always think, oh, it's going to be, especially with higher cognitive functions, you think it's going to be A and maybe B, but then it turns out to be X, Y, and Z, like it's completely different than you would expect it. And always kind of seeing that, for the first time is kind of interesting, I find. But yeah, that's kind of the most recent things that we're kind of focusing on. One problem, obviously, that with this brain imaging fMRI, it does cost a lot of money. Like the latest
Yeah.
study at the 70, it's like $1,000 Australian dollars per person to scan. So,
Yeah.
even if you just scan like 30 or 50 people, that's easily like $50,000. And I'm sure as well, like competition for grants always gets very tricky,
Yeah.
especially if at smaller universities. So yeah, it becomes a bit harder as well sometimes to keep doing the expensive fMRI studies, even though it's really my passion. Um, but yeah.
We had so I retired from the National Institute on Aging a few years ago, and before COVID hit, there's a neurologist under me, Dimitros Kapagiannis, and he, based on work we did in animals, we developed a protocol to look at the effects of intermittent fasting on cognition, neural network activity, did structural MRI, even did some MR spectroscopy where we could look at certain chemicals in one particular region of the brain. And so, but we had a dedicated MRI, at the institute that was only for studies. So yeah, so I know about the funding. That it was kind of nice to be at NIH for that reason. I was 11 years at a university, and I was pretty successful in getting grant money, but still it's amazing how much time is spent on writing grant proposals.
Oh yeah, true. Like I'm sure
Yeah.
it's the same as in the US, but yeah, even here it's like 10-15% success rate, and
Right.
then like you write 10 grants, and you might get one if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the time goes into that work, isn't it?
I was
And then
wondering, Pascal, it would be really interesting. I don't know if anyone else that the kind of field you're in, social neuroscience and really getting into the neuroscience of it, is non-invasive brain stimulation, like transcranial magnetic stimulation. And
mm,
you could have maybe I don't know, in the same subject, you could have them do some scenario, that the kinds of things you've been describing, someone feeling pain or whatever, and then you've got kind of mapped out what brain regions are active in those
mm.
situation, and then you can use TMS to either inhibit or activate certain areas, and then see how that affects their response to your questions.
Yeah. I mean, I've used TMS in the past, also kind of I'm doing my master and things like that, and even afterwards, of course, like TDCS as well. Um, yeah, personally, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the methods. I mean, it depends a little bit maybe what you're studying. If you're studying some like lower level things, like say if you want to see like a motor response in your little finger, and you do TMS over the primary motor cortex, or are you doing some basic visual things, and you do like a lot of stimulations. But personally, I'm not necessarily. I know people have done it, but personally, I'm not necessarily a strong believer that you can really manipulate higher level cognitive functions with just a little bit of stimulation to one specific brain region. Like even when I was using TMS, and let's say putting it over the motor cortex, and you put it like you get a little twitch in your finger when you stimulate, but if you move it like a millimeter below, then the twitch goes away. You know what I mean? Like, so it's you have to be at the exact same spot. And obviously with higher cognitive functions, we don't get that direct feedback. Your moral thing, let's say, might be here, but another person might be a centimeter lower. And obviously it's not one specific brain region or one spot. There's like 10 different spots kind of all working together to kind of build that higher level moral thing. So it's very hard. And also a lot of the regions, like say the amygdala, for example, are very deep in the cortex. You wouldn't be able to kind of stimulate it anyway, I guess, with TMS at the cortex. So a lot of these things I would say are very hard, if not impossible, to manipulate, I would say, with TMS. So that's why I'm not necessarily a fan of that for studying those things. But
Unfortunately, so animal studies, you can do all these kinds of manipulations, but it's it's really hard to look at these kinds of things.
Yeah,
And
humans are almost limited, right? Like in rats, if you do, okay, I'll take that brain region away, or I'll put them, that drug, and see what kind of happens, even higher cognitive functions. But in humans, we cannot say, oh, I'm going to take away, the amygdala, I'm going to take away half of the frontal cortex, and then see if people become more racist, for example. So, yeah, it's always a bit tricky, I guess, with human research. Yeah, especially with these higher functions.
What about the fluctuations in any individual, fluctuations in their relative, I guess, in-group bias or something over time? For example, exercise. I don't know if you exercise regularly, but when I exercise regularly, like my mood is a lot better than when I don't. And I think, I'm thinking about the kinds of tests you're describing, and this kind of my intuition says, depending on, if I'm exercise regularly, my mood's pretty good. I've had some injuries and stuff and couldn't, and like my mood goes down, and I'm more ornery and kind of grumpy, I guess you'd say. So, you mentioned that, and I know you were on a paper some about looking at like how COVID affected social interactions and these kinds of things you've been talking about. So, terrorist attacks, COVID wars, that all has a huge impact on an individual's relative, maybe what one person their attitude towards something before COVID would be quite different than during it when they couldn't work or things like that. So clearly there's fluctuations. So I guess what I'm getting to in the end is there any ways that individuals can kind of work? Are there any kind of tricks or things they can implement to kind of improve their agreeability across group, across race, across political party, intercountry or whatever?
Yeah, there's one, I kind of worked briefly at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, where we also have like this research dedicated scanner, and there some of the colleagues like Tanya Singh was kind of leading their projects. They had a big project called the Empatome Project, where people were being trained to feel more empathy over a long kind of period. So they had a large group of people that they kind of trained with a meditation approach, and they kind of made a distinction between what they call kind of more like a loving kind of kindness kind of empathy, where you kind of feel empathy and love. It's kind of more like in a Buddhistic tradition. So, when you kind of see someone in pain, for example, you don't necessarily feel the pain yourself, but you kind of feel like a feeling of love, a feeling of care, and it kind of makes you more happy and caring for others. But at the same time, they also trained other people to be, let's say, more traditionally empathic, where, when someone is in pain, you kind of more share their emotions. But in those cases, when you see someone in pain, you kind of more get distressed yourself if we talk about the affective empathy component. So there, that kind of trained people like differently in these two different styles. And but I found that after like months of kind of training people with these different styles and then presenting people inside an MRI scanner with situations of people being in a stress, that this loving kindness trained people felt much more positive emotions, much more feeling, and reported, more positive emotions compared to the other group who, trained a little bit more in the stress kind of affective empathy style. So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. So yeah, there's definitely ways to kind of train cells, and obviously if you kind of, as you mentioned, exercise and if you feel better yourself, you're also typically more positive towards others and feeling towards others. But yeah, it's definitely something that you can train, I guess, over time. So and then people obviously can change their mind, they can change their opinions over time. Can go both ways, I guess. People can become more against our group members, and they can, I guess, be trained to become more pro our group members. But yeah, it's definitely malleable in the case.
Yeah. And at the institute you're at, so how many investigators are there?
Well, we're only a kind of a small kind of institute, so maybe we have like around 10 people, I would say, kind of like research kind of active in our institute. Do also like different types of research. But it's more like a small kind of institute with kind of training, I would say, psychologists, more focused on training honors and master students in psychology, so clinical psychology, master of professional psychology. So it's more like a specific institute focused on that. So it's very different than, like, for example, where I was like previously, the University of Melbourne is probably like, Monash University is actually the biggest in Australia in regards to numbers, but maybe Melbourne University may be the most prestigious, but that is much more focused obviously on the research and the big kind of research. But yeah, even at our institute, we try to do kind of a lot of novel research and try to, also like investment now in AI and things like that. So yeah, but it's a very different environment than a big university.
So you teach a lot then?
Yeah, kind of doing a lot of like the research components that I'm teaching. So for students, kind of how to train them. Like for example, the honor students have to do like an honors thesis, right? So I'm coordinating those units, and then the master students have to do like do a systematic review. So I'm coordinating those units, and then we also have some DSAC students who are doing some research. So yeah, it's mostly kind of the research units that I'm teaching. But yeah, the other units are very much practical units for our master students, how to become a psychologist, I guess. Yeah, so it's a bit different.
Yeah, interesting. And do you have
Mhm.
family back in Belgium?
Yes, all my family still live in Belgium, so even very kind of close family members, they almost all live in the same small town in Belgium. So nice. But yeah, Australia is a very nice country, very nice to live. But the only downside of Australia is so isolated from the rest of the world almost. Like in Belgium and in Europe, you can go, in 3 hours, you can go to like 15 different countries. In Australia, almost have to fly at least 7 8 hours to visit another place. Even going from one side to Australia to the other side can easily take 5 hour flight or something. So
when I was growing up, I think the first thing I learned about Belgium was I used to, when I was like in high school, so a teenager, I used to race motocross,
okay,
dirt bikes.
yeah.
And back then, this is like the early 70s,
Mhm.
the best motocross riders were in Europe, and moreover, the best ones were in Belgium, from Belgium.
Yeah, I remember there was like this Belgium world champion who won 7 8 times world
Roger de
champion.
Coster.
Yeah, the name sounds familiar. And
Roger de
Verboers or
Coster,
something, I think it was also a famous one. Um, yeah, but it was quite popular in Belgium. I
yeah.
remember that. Mhm.
I haven't been to Belgium. I have actually two postdocs that were with me at NIA, and they're in Belgium now at
Yeah,
uh, at Leuven, actually.
yeah,
Uh,
that's where I studied at
yeah,
University of Leuven.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Yeah, it's a very nice city. They should definitely visit. Especially if it's students, it's almost like the ideal student university because it's kind of like it's all buildings and the camps across all the city, and like the whole city is very much focused on students. Like 1/3 of the population is students, and they have bars. Like the central square is basically around 30 bars all connected to each other, and in summer everybody sits there, and there's like every university has their own cafe as well and things like that. It's a very good atmosphere, I guess, if you're young and a student. You have
yeah,
a very good time there growing up.
yeah.
But yeah, it's a really good university as well. Do a lot of good research there.
Yeah. Okay, Pascal, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. I'm going to put links in the description section to some of your papers, and yeah, on xenophobia, in-group bias, empathy, number of
Mm,
different things there that you've had come out.
right.
So anyway, this is an important area that kind of a key question as always is, besides, the basic importance of science and increasing understanding is, you know, how do we translate this to improvements in society? Because, I mean, we can educate people that, these things are going on in your brain, this is normal, but, we somehow got to figure out how to,
Yeah.
is that going to be enough? I mean,
Well, yeah, that's always, sometimes like criticism of the brain injury work that we do is kind of, okay, how does it help us in the real world, if we better understand our brain regions or what goes on. I mean, I like to think, maybe I'm biased because I'm kind of really interested in neuroscience and brain imaging and things like that, but I find that, again, maybe coming back to that example I talked about between the different political groups, I think if you can see what kind of happens in a person's brain, that we process the exact same information very differently depending on people's beliefs. even if objectively the information is exactly the same. Just kind of seeing those results and kind of, remember presenting those results at scientific conferences, but also at lay people conferences and things like that. And I find that people really seem to kind of get it. And I feel like if you better understand that what's kind of going on in your own mind, in your own brain, that it can help people as well to, to maybe think, oh, maybe that person isn't as bad as I think it is, or, or maybe if I can see it from their viewpoint, I might have a slightly, different idea about it. So I think, yeah, people just being aware, that we have a kind of a lot of biases, and just kind of be open, I guess, for different opinions and taking them on board. It doesn't necessarily mean you always have to, believe what other people say or go along what people say, but just kind of listening to different opinions, I think is quite important.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of try to do that as well, in my own life, where I try to listen to, different news outlets from the right to the left, and just to kind of hear people different opinions. Sometimes, often don't agree with what people saying, and potentially on both sides. But I think it's always very informative to try to get a better understand where do people kind of come from. What do they think?
Yeah,
So
politics it's all kind of foreign to me because it's based on propaganda. I mean, that's the whole thing, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's
No, I mean,
it's propaganda trying to, and there's a lot of, besides misinformation and outright falsehoods, there's leaving out things that they don't want, that go against what they're trying to. Or another thing I found a lot in the United States, particularly on the right wing media, they have a lot of anecdotes or individual person. This individual immigrant committed a crime, right? And they ignore the statistics on crime committed by citizens versus non-citizen immigrants, which it turns out citizens are more likely to commit crimes than these immigrants. So anyway, that's just one example of, because as scientists, we recognize the difference between an anecdotal case and the whole big picture, and looked at it in a statistical way. That, in other words, the difference between possibility and probability. And
no, definitely. And I mean, I also think it's kind of useful having these kind of podcasts because, yeah, what you kind of lot see in I would say more traditional media is kind of this, taking snippets out of like an hour interview and then kind of presenting that out of context.
yeah.
And then, it kind of always kind of looks bad. But then if you listen to the whole interview, it often kind of makes sense within that context.
Yeah.
And but then, yeah, it's obviously just presented on the news as like a 5-second clip. But, now more and more of getting these podcasts of like 3 hours and 2 hours, people talking, and then and it's also getting a lot of views, right? Like in the past, something on TV with like a 2-hour interview, maybe nobody will watch it, but now there's a lot of like literally millions of people are sometimes watching these podcasts of famous people, and there you get a really in-depth interview, people go real discussion, and often I find kind of listening to that, even people who you think are like very extreme, when you actually listen to them for like 2 hours in this one-to-one conversation, that they it sounds more human than
Well, I think
than it.
yeah, the problem there is that something you mentioned before, most people don't have time to look in depth at anything. Since I retired, before I retired, I didn't really spend much time at all. I didn't pay much attention to the news, but now I have time, and I'm going into a lot of detail, like, for example, all these indictments against Trump, right, for crime. I'm actually reading through, whatever the 90-page, 90-page indictment, and what's the evidence that was the basis for that, and so on. And or I don't spend much time on this, but as far as what's going on in Congress, occasionally I'll actually just watch a whole session where they're debating something back and forth over a 3-hour period. But But if you don't do that and you just look like the mainstream media, and a lot of it's biased one way or the other, then
No,
you're not gonna really understand actually what's going on.
no, definitely. No, I get that impression as well. So, but yeah, I don't know. I feel there's almost now a little bit of a, obviously a lot of people don't necessarily do that, but I feel there's a little bit of more of a counter movement that, where people are trying to, maybe step a little bit more of away of these kind of extremes and, maybe going back to the center and basically, yeah, just kind of listening and spending a little bit more time to,
I hope
to
so.
different opinions. So, I don't think it's all bad. So, because yeah, sometimes you feel as well that how things are being presented, that things are getting worse and worse. But I mean, for example, Steven Pinker wrote kind of a lot about this, like in his book, Budding Angels, and but yeah, if you look at it like over time, over history, things are actually, in regards to intergroup relations, things are getting much more better. Like, in the
Yeah.
past, a lot of people were getting killed, like, almost like half of the people getting killed in wars. Well, nowadays, it's maybe like less than 1%. So it's not that it's all getting worse
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
true.
So
Although
yeah,
there's
but
still a lot of disparities, right?
well, yeah, definitely. And also another thing is obviously now we have much bigger weapons if you think about the
Yeah.
other day I was listening to the podcast about, atomic bombs, what would happen even if someone would drop a bomb and then, retaliation and how many billions of people would die. And that's another thing I think where it's important to kind of keep looking at the intergroup relations because, people might think, okay, we're getting more civilized and things like that. So wars are over, but as we see, they're not. And yeah, especially now with weapons becoming more sophisticated and bigger, I think it's important to keep,
And also
being mindful.
the climate change is going to lead to a lot of conflicts. I think it's already
Yeah.
contributing to migration, human migration,
Mm.
and that's going to get
Well,
that's
yeah, and the resources, obviously. I mean, that's
yeah,
another important thing because people are very, open and friendly as long as there's enough resources.
yeah,
But once there's not enough resources, you can quickly see, the in-groups becoming much more smaller and much more protective.
yeah,
And in those situations, things can go pear-shaped very quickly.
yeah,
So yeah, I think there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of things moving in the right direction, but I think we always have to be mindful as well that things can change
yeah,
very quickly. I guess we see it as well now with political parties often going more to the extreme in Europe and in America as well and other countries. Um, but yes, we have to always be mindful of these things. I guess not make the same mistakes as we did maybe in the past.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, Pascal, it was nice to meet you and talk with you. I enjoyed it.
yeah, me too. Nice meeting you. Thanks for inviting me. Good luck
Okay,
with the rest of the podcast. Yeah.
okay. Bye.
Right.